I used to think the house was too big for me. After my husband passed, the rooms felt cavernous, each one echoing with memories I wasn't ready to face. I spent years tiptoeing around them, filling my days with busy work so I wouldn't have to confront the silence. And then Nathan moved back in. He had called out of the blue, his voice tinged with that mix of boyish charm and quiet hesitation that always made me want to take care of him. "Stepmom," he'd said, the word sounding far too formal for how close we used to be. "I just need somewhere to crash for a while. A couple of months maybe, just until I figure things out." I didn't hesitate. Of course, he could stay. The house was too big, after all. I told myself it would be nice to have someone else around, someone to break the quiet. But now, as I stood in the spare room with him helping me organize boxes, I wasn't sure I had fully understood what I'd agreed to. Nathan wasn't the gangly teenager I remembered. He was 25 now, tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. His laugh was deeper, his movements more deliberate, and his gaze, when it landed on me, felt sharper, more knowing than it used to. "Here, let me grab that," he said, reaching past me to take a box I was struggling with. His arm brushed against mine, and the contact sent a shiver down my spine that I immediately tried to ignore. "Thanks," I said quickly, stepping back to put some space between us. "No problem," he replied, setting the box down with ease. He glanced over at me, his lips curving into a teasing smile. "You've got way too much stuff, you know that?" "It's not stuff," I said, crossing my arms. "It's memories." Nathan laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. "You're going to run out of room for memories if you keep holding on to everything." I opened my mouth to retort, but before I could, his attention shifted. He had picked up another box, this one smaller and marked with my handwriting, "Personal." "What's in here?" he asked, turning it over in his hands. "Nothing," I said quickly, reaching for it. But Nathan held it out of reach, his brows lifting in mock curiosity. "Nothing, huh? You labeled a box personal for nothing?" "Give it back," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Nathan's smile faltered slightly, his gaze flicking to mine. He must have seen something in my expression because he set the box down carefully, his teasing demeanor replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. "Sorry," he said, stepping back. "Didn't mean to pry." "It's fine," I said, though my hands were trembling as I picked up the box and placed it on the top shelf, out of reach. Nathan watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to keep everything locked away, you know," he said softly. The words struck a nerve, and I turned to face him, my chest tight. "Some things are better left alone," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Nathan didn't argue. He just nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned back to the pile of boxes. But the air between us had shifted, the easy rhythm of our banter replaced by something heavier, something unspoken. That night, I sat in my bedroom with the box on my lap. I hadn't opened it in years, not since I had packed it away in the weeks after my husband's funeral. It wasn't filled with anything particularly scandalous. Old letters, a journal, a photograph or two. But it was mine. A small collection of pieces I wasn't ready to share with anyone, least of all Nathan. I traced my fingers over the lid, my mind replaying the moment in the spare room. The look on Nathan's face when he had handed the box back to me, it wasn't just curiosity. It was something else. Something that made my stomach twist in a way I didn't want to think about. I set the box aside and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. But even as I closed my eyes, sleep wouldn't come. My mind was too busy replaying his words, his smile, the quiet way he had looked at me, as though he saw something I hadn't meant to show. The next morning, Nathan was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. He was standing at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee, and when he looked up and saw me, he smiled. "Morning," he said, his tone easy, as though nothing had changed. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile in return. But as I reached for a mug and poured my own coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted, and that no amount of busy work would be enough to make it go away. The atmosphere in the house felt different after that morning in the spare room. It wasn't something I could point to directly. No awkward confrontations or obvious changes in behavior. But it was there. A quiet, persistent tension that hung in the air whenever Nathan was around. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into the way his eyes lingered on me just a second too long, or the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something. And then, there was me. I couldn't stop thinking about the box. Every time I passed the closet, I felt its presence like a weight pressing against my chest. I had put it back on the shelf where it belonged, but the memory of Nathan's hands on it, of his gaze flickering with curiosity, haunted me. It wasn't the contents of the box itself that unsettled me. It was what it represented: my past, my vulnerability, the parts of myself I had carefully packed away and kept hidden. Nathan had come dangerously close to uncovering those parts, and the thought of him knowing more than he already did made my heart race in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. 2 days after the incident, I was in the living room folding laundry when Nathan walked in. He was carrying a toolbox, his hair slightly disheveled, and his t-shirt clinging to his chest in a way that made it hard to focus. "Hey," he said, setting the toolbox down with a thud. "The faucet in the upstairs bathroom is leaking. Thought I'd take a look." "Do you need any help?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I folded a towel. Nathan grinned, a playful glint in his eyes. "You offering to be my assistant?" "Only if you promise not to break anything," I said, unable to stop the smile tugging at my lips. "Guess I'll have to be on my best behavior then," he replied, his tone light, but his gaze lingering on me just a moment too long. He left the room a moment later, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That evening, we found ourselves in the kitchen together, an unspoken routine that had developed since Nathan moved in. I was chopping vegetables for a salad, and he was leaning against the counter, sipping a beer, and watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thanks for letting me stick around," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. I glanced at him, startled. "What brought that on?" He shrugged, his gaze dropping to the bottle in his hands. I know it can't be easy, having me here." "It's not hard," I said softly, setting the knife down and turning to face him. "You've been a big help." Nathan looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "Still, I just wanted you to know I appreciate it." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet intensity of his gaze, it was enough to make my chest tighten. "Your family, Nathan," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You don't have to thank me for being here." "Family," he repeated, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is that what we are?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and I didn't know how to respond. "Nathan," I began, but my voice faltered. He took a step closer, his expression softening. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You don't have to say anything." But the way he looked at me, the way his eyes searched mine as though he was trying to uncover some hidden truth, left me breathless. Later that night, as I sat alone in my bedroom, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in the kitchen. The way his voice had softened when he said my name, the way his gaze had lingered. It was as if he was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. I pressed my hands to my face, letting out a shaky breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. Nathan was my stepson. He wasn't mine by blood, but that didn't change the fact that there were lines we weren't supposed to cross. Lines I had spent the past few days teetering dangerously close to. But even as I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't deny the truth. Something had shifted between us, something I didn't know how to ignore. The following morning, I woke to the sound of soft music coming from the living room. Curious, I got out of bed and made my way downstairs, finding Nathan sitting on the couch with his guitar. He looked up when he saw me, his lips curving into a smile. "Morning." "Morning," I said, leaning against the doorway. "Couldn't sleep," he explained, his fingers moving deftly over the strings. "Neither could I admitted. Nathan gestured to the seat beside him. "Want to sit?" I hesitated, my chest tightening, but then I nodded and crossed the room to join him. As he played, the music filled the space between us, soft and soothing. For a while, we didn't speak, the quiet rhythm of his guitar saying more than words ever could. But even in the stillness, the tension between us remained, unspoken but undeniable. And I couldn't help but wonder how much longer we could keep pretending nothing had changed. The morning air was crisp, with the faintest chill, hinting that autumn wasn't far off. I was in the garage, sleeves rolled up and hands dusted with dirt as I sorted through a pile of old gardening tools. Cleaning the garage had been on my to-do list for years, one of those projects I always meant to tackle but never quite got around to. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the cluttered floor. "You started without me?" he asked, a teasing lilt in his voice. I glanced over my shoulder, brushing a strand of hair out of my face. "I didn't think you'd be interested." "Well, you thought wrong," he said, stepping inside. "What's the plan?" I couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. "The plan," I said, gesturing to the chaos around us, "is to figure out what's worth keeping and what needs to go." Nathan surveyed the mess, his hands on his hips. "So, everything needs to go?" "Not everything," I said, laughing despite myself. "But most of it, probably." "Got it," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Where do you want me to start?" For the next few hours, we worked side by side, sorting through boxes and bins. The garage was a treasure trove of forgotten memories. Old Christmas decorations, rusty tools, a box of photographs from a long-ago vacation. "Look at this," Nathan said, pulling out a pair of roller skates. I glanced over, my chest tightening at the sight of them. "I used to love those," I said softly. "Your dad bought them for me years ago. We'd go skating down by the boardwalk." Nathan's expression softened, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, holding them out to me. "Think they still fit?" "Probably not," I said, laughing as I took them from him. "But I'm keeping them anyway." "Fair enough," he said, his voice warm. As the day wore on, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the garage began to take shape. The piles of clutter slowly shrank, replaced by neat stacks of labeled boxes and organized shelves. Nathan found an old radio in one of the boxes, and to my surprise, it still worked. He tuned it to a classic rock station, the familiar notes of a Fleetwood Mac song filling the space around us. "Now we're talking," he said, grinning as he set the radio on a shelf. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling as he started singing along, his voice low and surprisingly good. "You know," I said, shaking my head, "you're not half bad." "Not half bad," he repeated, feigning offense. "I'll have you know, I was in a band in college." "Oh, really?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Yep," he said, leaning casually against the workbench. "We weren't famous or anything, but we had fun." I laughed, the sound light and unguarded. It felt good, better than I'd felt in a long time. By the time we called it a day, the garage looked better than it had in years. The clutter was gone, replaced by a sense of order and accomplishment. Nathan wiped his hands on a rag, his expression satisfied. "Not bad for a day's work," he said. "Not bad at all," I agreed, leaning against the workbench. He looked at me then, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You know, you're kind of amazing," he said softly. The words caught me off guard and I felt my cheeks flush. "What are you talking about?" "Just the way you handle everything," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You've been through so much, but you keep going. You're stronger than you think." His honesty, his openness. It left me breathless. "Nathan?" "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, his tone gentle. "I just wanted you to know." The silence that followed was thick and charged, and I didn't know what to do with it. That evening, we sat on the porch together, a bottle of wine between us. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air was cool and still. Nathan poured me another glass, his movements slow and deliberate. "To a job well done," he said, raising his glass. "To a job well done," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. We sipped in silence for a while, the quiet stretching out between us like a bridge. "You know," Nathan said suddenly, "I think today was the most fun I've had in a long time." I glanced at him, surprised. "Really?" "Yeah," he said, his smile soft. "It's been a while since I've felt, I don't know, at home, I guess." His words struck a chord, and I felt my chest tighten. "I'm glad," I said softly. He looked at me then, his gaze lingering. "Me too," he said quietly. The way he said it, the way his voice wrapped around the words, it was enough to make my breath hitch. I looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. "We should probably call it a night," I said, my voice trembling. "Yeah," Nathan said, though he didn't move right away. For a moment we just sat there, the tension between us thick and unspoken. And then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. "Nathan," I began, but I didn't know what I was going to say. He pulled his hand back, his expression soft but unreadable. "Good night," he said, standing and heading inside. I sat there long after he was gone, the warmth of his touch lingering on my skin. And for the first time, I let myself wonder what it might mean. The house was dark and still when I finally made my way inside. I had stayed on the porch longer than I should have, my thoughts circling endlessly around the way Nathan's hand had brushed against mine, the way his voice had softened when he said good night. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was a fleeting moment, nothing more. But no matter how many times I repeated the words in my head, they rang hollow. I climbed the stairs quietly, careful not to wake Nathan, though the truth was, I didn't know if he was asleep. The thought of him lying awake, thinking about the same things I was, sent a shiver through me. In my room, I turned on the small lamp by the bed and sank onto the mattress, letting out a shaky breath. The day had been long, full of small, unexpected moments that had left me feeling raw and unsteady. I didn't know how to make sense of it, of the way Nathan looked at me, the way his presence filled the space around me like something solid and real. It was as though the air between us had changed, charged with a tension that neither of us could name but both of us could feel. I was still sitting there, lost in thought, when I heard it. The faint creak of a floorboard outside my door. My breath caught, and a moment later, there was a soft knock. "Come in," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The door opened slowly and Nathan stepped inside. He was barefoot, wearing a plain t-shirt and pajama pants, his hair slightly tousled as though he had been lying down. "Did I wake you?" I asked, my heart pounding. He shook his head, leaning against the doorframe. "No, I couldn't sleep." "Me neither," I admitted, my hands twisting together in my lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. "Mind if I sit?" Nathan asked finally, his voice low. I hesitated, then nodded, shifting slightly to make room. He crossed the room and sat down beside me, the mattress dipping under his weight. The closeness was almost unbearable. I could feel the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breath, and it took everything in me not to lean into him. "Today was nice," he said after a while, his voice breaking the quiet. "Yeah," I said softly. "It was." Nathan turned to look at me, his gaze steady. "You work too hard, you know that?" I let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Keeps me busy," I said, avoiding his eyes. "Maybe you don't have to be so busy all the time," he said gently. I shook my head, my chest tightening. "It's easier that way," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Easier doesn't mean better," Nathan said quietly. The simplicity of his words left me breathless. I turned to look at him, my eyes searching his face for something I couldn't name. "Nathan, why are you here?" His brow furrowed slightly, as though the question had caught him off guard. "Because I wanted to make sure you were okay," he said simply. "I'm fine," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "No, you're not," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. The truth of his words hit like a blow, and I felt my throat tighten. "Nathan, I don't." "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, cutting me off gently. The vulnerability in his voice, the quiet intensity in his gaze, it was too much. The tears came before I could stop them, hot and unrelenting, and I covered my face with my hands, letting out a shaky breath. Nathan didn't hesitate. He reached out, pulling me into his arms, holding me tightly as I cried against his chest. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice steady and soothing. "You don't have to do this alone." His words, his touch, they broke something in me. I clung to him, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt as the sobs racked my body. "I've been so alone," I whispered, the words tumbling out between broken breaths. "For so long." "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly, his hand moving in slow, soothing circles across my back. The quiet conviction in his voice, the warmth of his touch, it was enough to make the tears begin to subside. When I finally pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms, grounding me. I looked up at him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and something I couldn't name. "Nathan, this isn't..." "Isn't what?" he asked gently, his gaze searching mine. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," I said, my voice trembling. "Who says?" he asked softly. I couldn't answer him. The truth was, I didn't know. The silence between us stretched, thick and unrelenting, and I felt my breath catch as his hand moved to my face, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. You deserve to feel something again, he said quietly. His words left me breathless, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into his touch, my eyes closing as a shaky breath escaped me. Nathan, I whispered, but whatever I was going to say was lost as his forehead rested against mine, the closeness sending a shiver through me. You don't have to be scared, he said softly. But I was. I was terrified, and yet I didn't pull away. The next morning was bright and crisp, the sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, as though the night before hadn't happened. I stood at the counter, pouring myself a cup of coffee, but my hands trembled slightly as I gripped the mug. Sleep had eluded me, my thoughts circling endlessly around the way Nathan had held me, the warmth of his touch, the way his words had unraveled something inside me. When I heard his footsteps on the stairs, my heart jumped, a flutter of nerves and anticipation that I tried to ignore. Morning, he said as he walked into the kitchen, his voice soft but steady. Morning, I replied, keeping my gaze fixed on the coffee. He moved to the fridge, pulling out the carton of orange juice and pouring himself a glass. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the clink of glass against the counter. I couldn't look at him. Not yet. You okay? Nathan asked, leaning casually against the counter as he sipped his juice. I'm fine, I said quickly, though the tightness in my chest betrayed me. You don't look fine, he said gently, his tone probing but kind. I finally glanced up at him, my chest tightening at the way his eyes softened when they met mine. I didn't sleep much, I admitted, my voice quieter now. Me neither, he said, his gaze steady. The simplicity of his words, the quiet honesty, it left me breathless. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the handle of my mug. Nathan, about last night. You don't have to say anything, he said quickly, cutting me off. No, I do, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I don't know how to do this. You don't have to know, he said softly, taking a step closer. We'll figure it out. The space between us felt impossibly small, and I could feel the warmth of him, the quiet strength in his presence. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath catching as his hand brushed lightly against mine where it rested on the counter. The touch was fleeting, barely there, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. I glanced up at him, startled, and the look in his eyes stopped me cold. It was unguarded, raw, filled with a mix of longing and uncertainty that mirrored my own. Nathan, I began, but I didn't know what I was going to say. You don't have to say anything, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't stay silent. This isn't supposed to happen, I said softly, my voice trembling. Why not? He asked, his tone gentle but insistent. Because it's not right, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Does it feel wrong? He asked, his voice steady. The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and I felt my breath catch. It doesn't matter how it feels, I said finally, my voice breaking. It does to me, Nathan said firmly, the quiet conviction in his voice, the unwavering intensity in his gaze. It was too much. I looked away, my chest tight as I tried to steady myself. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I know, he said softly. I am too. His hand moved again, this time brushing lightly against my arm, and the warmth of his touch sent a rush of heat through me. I didn't pull away, though every part of me screamed that I should. You don't have to be scared, Nathan said gently. Not with me. His words wrapped around me like a lifeline, and for the first time in years, I felt something other than loneliness. But the fear was still there, clawing at the edges of my mind. This could ruin everything, I whispered, my voice trembling. Or it could change everything, he said simply. The simplicity of his words, the quiet strength in his tone, it was enough to make my chest ache. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a moment the world around us faded into nothing. The air between us was charged, electric, and I knew that if I didn't move, if I didn't step away, I might not be able to stop myself. But I didn't move. Nathan's hand lingered on my arm, his touch firm but gentle, and I felt myself leaning into him, drawn by something I couldn't name. When his other hand lifted to brush a strand of hair from my face, I felt my breath hitch. The closeness was unbearable, the tension between us a living, breathing thing that neither of us could ignore. Nathan, I whispered, my voice breaking. I know, he said softly, his forehead resting lightly against mine. The moments stretched, fragile and infinite, and I knew we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. But in that moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The day passed in a blur. I busied myself with tasks that didn't need doing, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to that moment in the kitchen. Nathan's hand on my arm, his forehead brushing mine, the quiet intensity in his voice when he said, "You don't have to be scared." But no amount of dusting or rearranging could erase the warmth of his touch or the memory of the way he looked at me, like I was something fragile but worth holding on to. When night finally came, I thought I might find relief in the quiet, but the stillness of the house only amplified the storm inside me. I tossed and turned in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs as my mind raced. And then, just as I was teetering on the edge of sleep, I heard it again. The soft creak of the floorboards outside my door. A part of me hoped he would walk past back to his room. Another part of me, the part I didn't want to admit existed, hoped he wouldn't. There was a soft knock, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "Come in," I said, my voice trembling. The door opened slowly, and Nathan stepped inside. He didn't turn on the light, but the faint glow of the moon streaming through the curtains illuminated his face, his features etched with something I couldn't quite name. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said softly. "You didn't," I replied, sitting up and pulling the blanket around my shoulders. "I couldn't sleep." He hesitated for a moment, then closed the door behind him and leaned against it. "Me neither." The air between us was thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I didn't know how to break the silence, didn't know if I even wanted to. Nathan took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he began, his voice low. I looked away, my chest tightening. "Nathan, Just let me finish," he said gently, cutting me off. I nodded, my hands clutching the blanket tightly. "I know this isn't typical," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I know there are reasons we shouldn't feel this way, but I also know that I can't stop thinking about you." His words left me breathless, and I felt my throat tighten. "Nathan, this isn't right," I said softly, though the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Does it feel wrong to you?" he asked, his voice steady. I couldn't answer him. I didn't trust myself to. He stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me," he said quietly. "It feels like the first thing that's made sense in a long time." The honesty in his voice, the quiet vulnerability in his gaze, it unraveled me. "Nathan, I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together." The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his tone, it was enough to make my breath hitch. Before I could stop myself, I reached out, my fingers brushing lightly against his hand. The touch was tentative, hesitant, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. Nathan's hand turned, his fingers curling around mine in a gentle but firm grip. His other hand moved to my face, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. "You deserve to feel something again," he said softly, his voice breaking. The tears came before I could stop them, hot and unrelenting, and I felt my chest tighten as he pulled me into his arms. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice steady and soothing. "You don't have to be alone anymore." His words, his touch, they broke something in me. I clung to him, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt as the tears spilled over. When I finally pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms, grounding me. His gaze searched mine, unflinching and full of something I couldn't name. And then, as though pulled by some invisible force, he leaned in. The first brush of his lips against mine was soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands moving to his shoulders as the kiss deepened. It was slow at first, almost cautious, but the warmth of his mouth, the steady strength of his hands on my back, unraveled me completely. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a release. A breaking of all the walls I had spent years building around myself. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths were ragged, our foreheads resting together. I could feel the rapid thrum of his heartbeat against mine, and it mirrored the rush of blood in my ears. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Maybe," he said, his lips brushing lightly against mine. "But it's real." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet strength in his gaze, It was enough to make my chest ache. For the first time, I let myself believe him. I woke to the soft glow of early morning light filtering through the curtains, casting the room in muted gold. For a moment, I didn't move, my body warm and cocooned in the quiet stillness of the house. But as my senses returned, the events of the night before came rushing back, and my chest tightened. Nathan. I turned my head and found the space beside me empty, the blanket slightly rumpled but cool to the touch. For a fleeting second, I felt panic rise, wondering if he had left to avoid the inevitable conversation that hung in the air between us. But then I heard movement downstairs, the faint clatter of dishes, the low hum of his voice as he murmured something I couldn't make out. Relief washed over me, and I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing as I sat up and ran a hand through my hair. I took a moment to steady myself, to gather the courage I wasn't sure I had, before slipping out of bed and padding downstairs. The smell of coffee greeted me as I entered the kitchen. Nathan was standing at the stove, barefoot and shirtless, his broad back turned to me as he flipped something in a pan. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard me, a soft smile curving his lips. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. Nathan turned back to the stove, his movements relaxed. "I made eggs," he said, gesturing to the counter where 2 plates sat, already prepared. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest as I took in the casual intimacy of the moment, the way he moved so comfortably in my space, the way his presence filled the room without feeling overwhelming. "Thank you," I said softly, taking a seat at the table. Nathan brought the plates over, setting one in front of me before sitting across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us filled with the soft clink of silverware and the occasional creak of the old wooden chairs. But I couldn't ignore the weight in the air, the unspoken questions that lingered between us. "Nathan," I began, my voice trembling slightly. He looked up, his gaze steady. "Yeah?" I hesitated, my hands tightening around my fork. "About last night?" "You don't have to explain," he said gently, cutting me off. "I think I do," I said, my voice firmer now. Nathan set his fork down, leaning forward slightly. "Okay," he said softly, giving me the space to speak. I took a deep breath, my chest tight as I tried to find the words. "I don't regret what happened," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared. I don't know what this means, or where it's going, or how we even begin to make sense of it." Nathan's expression softened, and he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said quietly. "We don't have to figure everything out all at once." The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his tone, it was enough to make my breath hitch. "What if we can't?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Then we'll take it one step at a time," he said, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. "As long as we're honest with each other, we'll figure it out." His calm reassurance, the steady warmth of his gaze, it was enough to ease some of the fear clawing at my chest. "Okay," I said softly, my voice trembling. Nathan's smile was small but genuine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to hope for. Hope. The rest of the day passed quietly, the rhythm of our routines returning to something that felt almost normal. But there was a difference now. A quiet intimacy in the way Nathan moved around me, the way his hand brushed mine when we passed each other in the hallway, the way his gaze lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, we found ourselves on the porch again, a bottle of wine between us. The air was cool and still, the fading light casting everything in a soft golden glow. Nathan poured me another glass, his movements slow and deliberate. "To whatever comes next," he said, raising his glass. I hesitated for a moment, then raised mine as well. "To whatever comes next," I echoed. Our glasses clinked softly, and I took a sip, the warmth of the wine spreading through me like a balm. "I never thought I'd feel like this again," I admitted, my voice quiet. Nathan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Like what?" "Like I'm alive," I said softly, my gaze dropping to the glass in my hands. Nathan reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. "You deserve to feel alive," he said, his voice steady. The sincerity in his voice, the quiet strength in his touch, it was enough to make my chest ache. "I don't know where this is going," I said, my voice trembling. but I want to see where it leads." Nathan's smile was small but filled with a quiet kind of joy. "Me too," he said softly. We sat there in silence as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, the quiet between us filled with the promise of something new. For the first time in years, I felt like the future wasn't something to fear. The straps of my sundress fell from my shoulders at the worst possible moment, leaving me frozen in front of the mirror as I fumbled with my bra. The faint creak of the bedroom door pulled my attention, and when I turned, there he was. Ethan, my stepson, standing in the doorway. My heart stopped. His hand lingered on the doorknob, and for a moment he didn't move. Neither did I. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You shouldn't be here." I stammered, yanking the straps back into place, though my cheeks burned with the humiliation of being caught like this. But he didn't leave. He stood there, his gaze flickering from the undone straps to my face, an expression I couldn't quite place crossing his features. "Ethan," I said sharply, breaking the silence. "Right," he muttered, finally stepping back and closing the door behind him. I sank onto the bed, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. It was an accident, I told myself. Just an awkward moment that neither of us would talk about again. But even as I thought it, I couldn't shake the way his eyes lingered, the way the air felt heavier in that fleeting moment. By the time I ventured out of the bedroom, Ethan was in the kitchen, casually scrolling on his phone like nothing had happened. But when his gaze met mine across the room, I knew. Whatever line had existed between us was no longer there. It had been crossed. I married Daniel 10 years ago. He was older, established, and offered me the stability I craved after a tumultuous first marriage. His charm was quiet, his demeanor controlled, and his promises of a calm, steady life were enough to convince me that this was what I needed. Our house, a sprawling modern home perched at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, became my kingdom. But it also became my cage. Daniel's job as a corporate consultant meant he was rarely home. At first, I filled my days with charity events, book clubs, and home renovations. But over the years, the distractions lost their luster. The house grew quieter, the echoes of my own thoughts louder. When Ethan moved in after finishing university, it was meant to be temporary. A few months, Daniel said, until Ethan found his footing in the job market. I hadn't seen him much in the years since Daniel and I married. He lived with his mother, Karen, across the country. I wasn't prepared for the man who walked through the door. Ethan wasn't the awkward teenager I remembered from our first meeting. At 24, he was tall and confident, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without trying. His dark hair was perpetually tousled, his sharp blue eyes quick to catch everything around him. He carried himself with an ease that Daniel never had, his humor sharp but never cruel. At first I thought it was my imagination, the way he lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, the way he leaned against the counter and asked about my day as if he genuinely cared. But over time, I began to notice other things. The way his gaze lingered a second too long when I walked into the room. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way he always seemed to find reasons to be close. The incident with the dress changed everything. It wasn't just the moment itself, the intimacy of being caught in such a vulnerable position, but the way it lingered between us afterward. Ethan didn't mention it, and neither did I. But the tension between us grew, unspoken but undeniable. One evening, about a week later, we were sitting in the living room. The TV played softly in the background, but neither of us was watching. I was reading, or at least pretending to, while Ethan scrolled on his phone. "Do you ever feel like this house is too big?" he asked suddenly. I looked up, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes still on his phone. "It just feels empty sometimes, like it's meant for more people." I set my book down, studying him. "You didn't grow up here. It's always been like this for me." He glanced at me then, his gaze steady. "Doesn't it get lonely?" His question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. "Sometimes," I admitted finally. Ethan nodded as if he already knew. "Me too." Daniel called later that night, his voice distant as usual. He was staying an extra 2 days for meetings, leaving the house to Ethan and me. After I hung up, I wandered into the kitchen to make tea. Ethan was already there, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in hand. "Late call from Daniel?" he asked, his tone casual. "Another extension," I said with a shrug. Ethan smirked. "Does he even live here anymore?" The question stung more than I expected. "Work is important to him," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Must be nice," Ethan replied, his voice soft but pointed. "To be so busy you don't notice what's happening right in front of you." I frowned, unsure of his meaning. "What are you talking about?" Ethan stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said after a moment, his lips twitching into a small smile. "Just thinking out loud." But the weight of his words lingered long after he left the room. The following day, I found myself in the garden, pruning the roses that lined the stone path. Ethan appeared behind me, his footsteps light as he joined me. "Need help?" he asked, his voice easy. I glanced at him, surprised. "You know anything about gardening?" "Not a thing," he admitted, grinning. I handed him the shears anyway, guiding him as he awkwardly trimmed a few branches. His hands were steady, his movements precise as he followed my instructions. "This is kind of relaxing," he said after a while. I laughed softly. "Better than staring at your phone all day?" "Much," he said, his gaze meeting mine. The moment stretched, and I felt the now familiar flutter of tension between us. I looked away first, my cheeks warming under his steady gaze. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. The way he moved through the house, the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to see through every carefully constructed wall I had built. I told myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination born from too much time alone. But deep down I knew better. Ethan wasn't a boy anymore. And, whatever was happening between us, wasn't something I could ignore. The tension between us had become impossible to ignore. It simmered in every conversation, lingered in every glance. I told myself it was my imagination, a byproduct of loneliness and too much time alone with him in the house. But the truth was harder to face. Something had shifted, and neither of us seemed willing, or able, to stop it. The breaking point came one quiet evening. The house was dim, the only light coming from the lamp in the corner of the living room. I was curled up on the couch with a book, a glass of wine beside me, while Ethan sat on the floor, leaning against the coffee table as he scrolled through his phone. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. "Regret what?" "Marrying my dad," he said, his tone casual, but there was an edge to his words that made my chest tighten. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Why would you ask that?" He shrugged, setting his phone down. "Just curious. You don't seem happy." His words hung in the air, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. "Marriage isn't always about happiness," I said finally. "What is it about then?" "Stability. Partnership. Building a life together." Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sounds more like a business deal." I didn't respond, the truth of his observation stinging more than I cared to admit. The next day, the tension between us came to a head. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after lunch, when Ethan walked in. He moved to the sink, washing his hands as I wiped down the counters. "I didn't mean to upset you last night," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. "You didn't," I replied, though my tone was sharper than I intended. He turned to face me, his expression earnest. "You don't have to pretend with me, Miranda." I froze, my breath catching. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I see it," he said, stepping closer. "The way you keep everything bottled up, the way you're always trying to hold it together." I shook my head, stepping back. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" he asked, his gaze steady. "You deserve more than this, more than him." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I said, "Ethan, you can't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Because it's wrong, or because it's true?" The first time it happened, it was almost accidental. We were in the library. The door closed behind us as we sorted through old photo albums Daniel had asked me to organize. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by stacks of pictures, while Ethan leaned against the desk, flipping through an album. "Your dad was handsome when he was younger," I said, pointing to a photo of Daniel in his 20s. Ethan smirked. "You mean he peaked early?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Don't be mean." He looked up then, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. You're beautiful, you know that? The compliment caught me off guard, my cheeks warming. Ethan? I mean it, he said, his voice lower now. You're incredible. I should have stopped him. I should have laughed it off, changed the subject, done anything but what I did next. Instead, I met his gaze, my heart racing as I saw the sincerity in his eyes. And then he was kneeling in front of me, his hand brushing against mine. Tell me you don't feel it too, he whispered. I couldn't. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Every moment we spent together felt like walking a tightrope, the thrill of what we were doing tempered by the fear of being caught. We were careful, always watching for prying eyes, but the secrecy only heightened the intensity of our connection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves in the garden. The air was warm, the scent of roses heavy around us. Ethan reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. This can't last, I whispered, my voice trembling. Then let's make the most of it, he said, his gaze steady. The first crack in our secret came from an unexpected source. Marcus, Ethan's closest friend. He stopped by one afternoon, his easy charm masking a sharpness that made me uneasy. You've got a nice setup here, Marcus said as he sat on the edge of the couch, his eyes flicking around the room. We like it, I replied, forcing a smile. Marcus's gaze lingered on me a moment too long before he turned to Ethan. You're lucky, he said, his tone light but pointed. Not everyone gets to come back to this. Ethan tensed beside me, his posture stiffening. Marcus, don't. Don't what? Marcus asked, feigning innocence. Just making an observation. The conversation shifted after that, but the unease in the room didn't fade. Later that night, Ethan found me in the kitchen, his expression tense. He knows something, he said, his voice low. Marcus, my stomach twisting. Ethan nodded. He's not stupid, and he's always been nosy. What do we do? I asked, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. We keep quiet. He doesn't have proof. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach didn't ease. Secrets have a way of inviting complications, and ours was no different. It wasn't long before the fragile world Ethan and I had built began to show cracks. The first complication came in the form of Marcus, whose easy grin and playful banter masked a sharper, more calculating nature. It started with a casual visit. Marcus appeared at the door unannounced one Saturday afternoon, a six-pack of beer in hand and a smirk on his face. Ethan had been helping me rearrange the bookshelves in the library, his usual charm making the tedious task feel less burdensome. Looks cozy in here, Marcus remarked as he strolled in, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Marcus, Ethan said, his voice edged with surprise. What are you doing here? Thought I'd swing by, Marcus replied, leaning casually against the doorframe. Catch up, maybe. Didn't realize you were so busy. I forced a polite smile, stepping back from the bookshelves. We were just finishing up. Marcus's gaze flicked between us, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. Didn't mean to interrupt. The tension in the room was palpable, and I excused myself quickly, retreating to the kitchen. But even from there, I could hear their conversation, Marcus's teasing tone, Ethan's clipped responses, the subtle undertone of suspicion. Later that evening, Ethan found me in the kitchen, his expression tight. Marcus is nosy, he said, his voice low. He's your friend, I replied, though the unease in my chest mirrored his. That doesn't mean he doesn't notice things, Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. He knows me too well. What do you think he suspects? I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan hesitated, enough to be dangerous. The second complication came from Sophia, Daniel's business partner, whose sharp wit and unrelenting curiosity made her an unwelcome presence in my life. Sophia had always been more involved in Daniel's affairs than I was comfortable with. She had a knack for making herself indispensable, her loyalty to him bordering on obsessive. You look tired, Miranda, Sophia said one afternoon as she stopped by the house to drop off some documents for Daniel. I forced a smile, brushing off her comment. It's been a busy week. Busy with what? She asked, her gaze sharp. Just the usual, I replied, though the weight of her scrutiny made my pulse quicken. Sophia's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel's lucky to have you holding things down at home. Not everyone could handle it. The insinuation in her tone wasn't lost on me, and I felt a flicker of unease. Sophia was the type to dig deeper than she needed to, and her presence felt like a threat I couldn't afford to ignore. The walls began to close in after that. Marcus's visits became more frequent, his jokes laced with an edge that left me uneasy. Sophia's questions grew more pointed, her appearances at the house less about business and more about observation. One evening, as I stood in the garden pruning roses, Sophia appeared unexpectedly. "Beautiful flowers," she said, her voice startling me. I turned to find her standing at the edge of the garden, her arms crossed. "Sophia, I didn't hear you come in." "Daniel asked me to drop off some contracts," she said, her tone casual. "I thought I'd check the garden while I was here. It's always so peaceful out here." I forced a smile, though my hands trembled as I set down the shears. "It is one of my favorite places." Sophia stepped closer, her gaze flicking to the window where Ethan stood, watching us from the living room. "Ethan's grown into quite the young man, hasn't he?" My chest tightened. "He has." She tilted her head, studying me. "You seem close." "We've had more time to spend together lately," I said, keeping my tone light. "Must be nice," Sophia replied, her smile sharp. "Not everyone gets that kind of connection with their stepchildren." The turning point came during a dinner party at the house. Daniel had insisted on hosting, a rare display of enthusiasm that left me scrambling to prepare. Marcus and Sophia were both in attendance, their presence an unwelcome reminder of the precariousness of my situation. Throughout the evening, I felt their eyes on me, their subtle remarks and probing questions like needles under my skin. "You and Ethan make quite the team," Marcus said at one point, his tone light but his gaze piercing. "Ethan's been a big help," I replied, forcing a smile. "Must be nice having him around," Sophia added, her gaze sharp. "Especially with Daniel gone so often." I felt the blood drain from my face, but before I could respond, Daniel appeared, his hand on my shoulder. "Miranda keeps everything running smoothly," he said, his tone warm but possessive. For a moment, the tension in the room felt unbearable, the weight of their scrutiny suffocating. After the guests left, Ethan found me in the kitchen, his expression a mix of anger and concern. "They're trying to trap you," he said, his voice low. "I know," I replied, my hands trembling as I washed the dishes. "We need to be more careful," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "Ethan, this can't go on." His gaze softened, and he reached for my hand. "I won't let them ruin this. I won't let them ruin us." The conviction in his voice was enough to steady me, but the unease in my chest lingered. As the days passed, the cracks in our secret grew wider. Marcus's probing questions, Sophia's veiled remarks, Daniel's oblivious presence, it all felt like a ticking time bomb, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our time was running out. It started small, as these things often do. A misplaced item, a question asked too casually, a glance held a second too long. But small things have a way of snowballing, and before I knew it, the walls were closing in around us. The first major crack came when Daniel confronted me about my behavior. It was late, and the house was quiet. I was in the bedroom, brushing my hair in front of the mirror, when Daniel walked in. His tie was loose around his neck, and the faint smell of scotch clung to him. "You've been distant lately," he said, his tone even but laced with suspicion. I paused, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "I don't know what you mean." "You've been distracted," he pressed, stepping closer. "Is something going on I should know about?" My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I've just been busy. The house, the garden, it's a lot to manage." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that all it is?" "Of course," I said, turning to face him. "What else would it be?" He studied me for a moment longer before nodding. "I hope you're not keeping anything from me, Miranda. You know how important honesty is to me." His words felt like a warning, and I forced a smile, my stomach churning as he turned and left the room. Things only escalated from there. A week later, I found Sophia in the kitchen, her phone on the counter, as she poured herself a glass of water. "Hope you don't mind," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "I let myself in." "I wasn't expecting you," I replied, my tone cooler than I intended. "I had some documents for Daniel," she said, her gaze flicking to the living room where Ethan sat, engrossed in his laptop. "I thought I'd drop them off." Her eyes lingered on Ethan for a moment too long before she turned back to me, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "He's quite the presence, isn't he?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Ethan," she said, her tone light but pointed. He's grown up a lot since I last saw him. You must be proud. Of course, I said, my pulse quickening. Sophia's smile widened. It's nice, isn't it? Having him around must make the house feel a little less empty. Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I forced a laugh. It's been a change, that's for sure. That evening, as Ethan and I sat in the library, I told him about Sophia's remarks. She's watching us, I said, my voice trembling. She doesn't know anything, Ethan replied, his tone firm. She suspects something, I insisted. And Marcus isn't helping. He's been poking around too much. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. We'll deal with them, together. I wanted to believe him, but the weight of our situation felt heavier with each passing day. The breaking point came when Marcus cornered me at a neighborhood event Daniel had insisted we attend. The evening had been tense from the start, with Sophia hovering too close and Marcus's gaze following me wherever I went. I was stepping outside for air when Marcus appeared, his grin sharp and knowing. Enjoying the party? He asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. It's fine, I replied. My voice clipped. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. You know, you're not as subtle as you think you are. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay composed. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Miranda, he said, his grin widening. I see the way you and Ethan look at each other. I've seen enough to know what's going on. You're imagining things, I said, my voice trembling. Am I? He asked, his tone mocking. Because I've got a pretty good imagination. Before I could respond, Daniel appeared, his expression unreadable. What's going on here? Just making conversation, Marcus said smoothly, his smirk never fading. Daniel's gaze shifted between us, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Miranda, can I talk to you for a moment? Of course, I said, my heart pounding as I followed him back inside. Daniel's confrontation that night was quieter but no less devastating. You and Marcus seemed awfully tense, he said, his tone measured. Marcus was being inappropriate, I said, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. Daniel frowned. Inappropriate how? He made a comment about Ethan, I said, choosing my words carefully. Something about how close we've become. Daniel's frown deepened. And what did you say? I told him he was imagining things, I replied, meeting his gaze. Daniel studied me for a moment before nodding. Good, I won't have anyone spreading rumors about this family. His words were a relief. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the rumors became impossible to ignore. The final twist came when Sophia revealed her hand. She stopped by the house one afternoon, her usual charm replaced by a quiet intensity that set me on edge. I thought you should know, she began, her voice calm but firm, that Marcus has been talking. A lot. What are you talking about? I asked, my stomach twisting. About you and Ethan, she said, her gaze unwavering. I don't know if it's true, but Daniel won't take it well if he hears it from someone else. I froze, my mind racing. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want to see this family fall apart, Sophia said, though her tone lacked sincerity. Her words were a warning, and I knew our time was running out. The storm broke on a quiet evening. The house was still, with only the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen and the soft ticking of the clock in the living room. I had been pretending to read, my eyes scanning the same line of text over and over, when Daniel walked in, his expression sharper than I'd ever seen. Miranda, he said, his voice flat, we need to talk. My stomach dropped. I closed the book, setting it aside. What is it? Daniel remained standing, his gaze cold and calculating. Sophia told me something disturbing today, something about you and Ethan. The air left my lungs, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. What did she say? She said Marcus has been spreading rumors, Daniel replied. He claims there's something inappropriate going on between you and my son. I stood, my legs trembling. That's absurd. Marcus has always been jealous of Ethan. He's trying to cause trouble. Daniel crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing. Then why would Sophia feel the need to warn me? Why would Marcus even think he could say something like that? I don't know, I said, my voice shaking, but it's not true. Daniel stepped closer, his presence towering over me. Look me in the eye, Miranda, and tell me you haven't crossed any lines. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My silence hung between us like a confession. At that moment, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face pale but determined. Leave her alone, he said, his voice firm. Daniel turned, his eyes narrowing. So it's true? No, Ethan said quickly, but you're harassing her over some ridiculous rumor. She doesn't deserve this. Don't lie to me, Daniel snapped. I know when someone is hiding something. Ethan squared his shoulders. And I know when someone is looking for a scapegoat. You're never here, Dad. You have no idea what goes on in this house. Daniel's face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. Don't you dare lecture me about this family. This family? Ethan shot back, his voice rising. You don't care about this family. You only care about control. You've ignored Miranda for years, and now you're acting shocked that she might find comfort elsewhere? Ethan, I said sharply, but it was too late. Daniel turned to me, his expression a mix of fury and betrayal. So it's true? The confrontation spiraled out of control. Daniel shouted accusations, Ethan hurled truths, and I stood frozen in the middle, unable to stop the chaos. Finally, Daniel pointed to the door. Get out, he said to Ethan, his voice low and venomous. You're no longer welcome in this house. You can't do that, I said, stepping between them. Daniel's gaze turned to me, cold and unyielding. You can go with him, Miranda. If this is the life you've chosen, then you've made your decision. Ethan grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the door. Let's go, he said, his voice softer now. I hesitated, my heart breaking as I looked at Daniel one last time. But his face was stone, his love for me replaced by anger and disgust. I turned and walked out, leaving behind the life I had built for the uncertain promise of what lay ahead.